So my background is predominantly from a more rhetorical perspective when it comes to evidence and audience analysis. So I know people come from all walks of life, and every department works with evidence differently, and we all have different target audiences. So I mentioned briefly that my background's more in that rhetorical perspective. I teach in HCOM. I've been teaching cooperative argumentation for 16 years here now. And before that, my background was, I was a debater for Cal Poly, and then I was their assistant director of debate for Cal Poly in both San Jose State. So I do have more of that traditional, aspect of utilizing evidence, not so much just like drawing from readings, but we'll definitely work that into the day or the couple hours we have together. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is there's two key aspects when we think about evidence. So one is the evidence that we choose to use. And we have to choose that evidence carefully. And that's going to be the focus of today, so I'm actually going to put that one on the back burner. But the other aspect of how we use evidence is how we analyze that evidence. What do we do with it? How do we explain that evidence? And not even just us, but how does our source explain that evidence? How do they assume that that evidence actually supports the claim that they're trying to work with? So these two aspects are key to that whole evidence audience process. So one thing we want to think about with analyzing evidence, we want to bring that audience in, and we will get to that. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit just about the nature of that analysis. I give my students an example. It's it was a paper supporting the abolishment of the death penalty. And she argues that since we've had the death penalty as, since it was reenacted, basically, we've had 126 people who have been determined innocent on death row. So she makes the assumption, the way she explains that one piece of evidence is that if we found 126 people innocent on death row, it's logical to assume that more innocent people that there were innocent people who could have been put to death, right? So that's a logical assumption for her to make, because she's trying to argue that innocent people have died, basically, or it's unjust. Now, can you think of a different way to analyze that piece of evidence, that 126 people have been found innocent on death row? To maybe even argue the other side of the issue?
That they're wrong, they were really guilty.
Okay, and that would be one way to logically assess that. So if you're arguing in support of the death penalty, you could take that exact same piece of evidence and through your own logic and reasoning, come up with a totally different conclusion from it. Can anyone think of a different way to reason that for the other side of the issue? Give me your name again, please.
Ryan.
Ryan.
Trends in the way that people are prosecuted for crimes over time, and whether that matches those kind of charges.
So we can extend that piece of evidence and bring in other pieces of evidence that help us to understand it in a different light, potentially. That is definitely one way to do that.
Well, obviously, those 126 people who were innocent were saved from execution, and therefore the system works.
Bingo. Exactly. That's a very reasonable way to analyze that piece of evidence. That clearly death row or the death penalty works because all of the appeals processes, etc., are more likely to discover your innocence, right? So here we have the exact same piece of evidence, but based on how we interpret it and explain it to our audience, it has a completely different meaning, right? So we're just going to spend a little bit of time on this and do a really quick activity, and then the bulk of this is going to be more like target audience focus. But I didn't want to leave out that analysis part, given what this workshop series is all about as well. We started talking now about the importance of understanding our audience, or at least understanding that they exist. So what I do with my students at that point is we talk about being audience-centered with our writing or speaking versus speaker-writer-centered. And I think that seemed like a common theme I was hearing, that it's really hard to get our students to think about their audience and who they are, and that they really are part of this process. And I think it's more difficult with students than, say, when you enter into business, because I used to teach a professional communication course, and those students were a little more geared because they knew what they were doing in life, like they knew they were always going to have a target audience that they were trying to work with. But with the general population of students, it's about writing a paper. Do you pass it? Do you fail it? You know, do you pass the course? And that's how they tend to think sometimes. So I spend quite a bit of time talking about the difference between the two. So I wanted us just to have kind of a discussion about that. The benefits of audience-centered versus the benefits of writer-speaker-centered and the constraints of each. So let's start with writer-speaker-centered. And let me ask you, what are the benefits of actually being writer or speaker-centered with your presentations or papers? What would a benefit be?
A little easier to get into the head
Of yourself.
Of yourself.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
And if you're, well, and so yeah, I mean, on that part of it, you're not second guessing what you're trying to accomplish. You're going at it right from your own point of view.
Yeah, yeah, that's a definite benefit for sure.
Also, the speaker or the writer has the authority and gives a lot of information to the audience, and maybe the audience doesn't have that background knowledge. And so the writer kind of talks about things that he or she knows, and they're there to share, he or she will be able to share the information with the audience, useful information.
Okay, good. Nelson?
I think one of the things that being writer-centered does is it lowers the threshold. So if you're writing for other people, that can sometimes prevent you from expressing your ideas. And paying attention only to yourself lets you express yourself without worrying about what other people think.
Yeah, and Nelson, you're somebody who talks a lot about cognitive load, and I think it definitely decreases the cognitive load,
Yeah.
right? And that's why oftentimes we find that journal writing is actually grammatically better than academic writing in our classes because of that cognitive load being decreased. And that journaling is one of the few writings that really is about yourself only, right? That you are the audience of it typically. Okay, any other benefits you can think of? I mean, there's just some practical ones as well.
I think it might be easier too to just stay on point with your message, as opposed to being constantly pressured to think about what might please the audience or convince the audience, which could potentially dilute your message because you're going in several different directions.
Yeah, especially if you're trying to account for audience members who might see it differently than you, right? So how do you get that perspective in as well? Could become quite difficult sometimes. Ned, you had your hand up?
Yeah, if you, depending on what type of writing you're doing or speech you're giving, if you're doing a confession, it's got to be writer, speaker centered, or a protest where you don't feel your voice is being heard. You're centering on yourself.
Okay, Nelson?
I'll say another, which is that you need less information.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Is that what you're going to say,
Well,
Colin?
less research. You'd have to do less
Right.
research
Yeah.
about what your audience is all about. So you're
Well, also you need less information because you can assume that your reader is going to interpret things the way that you intend.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but you might have to go inward for more information.
Yeah.
If you're
Another one that we
confessing.
just talked about is that you don't have to provide the analysis, which oftentimes is a difficult part of it because it does start pushing us sometimes into assumptions, right? So we can avoid some of that analysis if we assume they're all thinking like we are as well. And when we don't need as much research or information, it saves time. So there's just a time practicality component to it as well. Okay, so let me ask you, what do you think the constraints are then for being writer-speaker centered? What are the problems with being?
You have to be careful of your bias. And, you have to think about. I mean, yes, there's less cognitive load, and you can say it like you want to, but in the same token, you have to be aware of your own preconceptions or your own stereotype. I mean, whatever it is that you're assuming, you just have to be aware of that. Make sure that you either announce it or avoid it.
And at this point with my students, I would ask, well, why would we want to avoid that? Or why would we want to acknowledge biases? Why is that important? And this starts getting them thinking about the audience a little bit more, like how the audience might perceive that message if they automatically assume there's a bias attached to it. And we are going to talk about ethos, pathos, logos today, so that goes right in with ethos, right? It starts decreasing your credibility if you assume there's an audience with biases. But if it's just for yourself, who cares? The biases are fine. But that's not how communication works typically. It's not usually just about ourselves. Okay, any other constraints?
Consequences.
And what are those
You had
consequences?
that cartoon where there's a guillotine right next to the king.
Yeah, and
So
the
you
king's
have
the
to think of your
gesture.
audience.
Yeah. Okay. So, and what are those consequences then?
Disapproval.
Disapproval. So, a big thing that we've all been talking about through the writing program and TLA is making our assignments authentic in nature. And I just want to ask you, do you think an assignment can be authentic if it doesn't account for the audience? Or the situation, which would probably include an audience.
I think there's a deeper philosophical question embedded there. I would argue that it's almost always important to consider audience, that you don't lose authenticity by incorporating audience into your message, because incorporating audience doesn't necessarily mean pandering to them. That's a good point. But I think a sort of individualistic or individual-centered definition of authenticity can see the audience as a compromise, considering the audience as compromise.
I think you're hearing authenticity differently than we're using authenticity.
Yeah, okay, so I was just thinking, maybe let's explain that. And maybe Nelson might want to take this one because that's his
One of my
catchphrases.
preaching points.
Yeah, which we have all bought into wholeheartedly. So I'll let Nelson give you a brief definition of that.
So you're talking about authenticity to the individual. What we're talking about is authentic tasks, as in tasks that are authentic to real-world experience. And so authentic as in what kinds of written or oral presentations would people do as adults for self-motivated purposes. So that's what I mean, and that's what the sort of comp background means by authentic audience, or authentic task. And so that's where, but I hear the key philosophical question about what authenticity is and those different lenses with which to view authenticity.
Yeah, Calvin kind of gave an example when he talked about creating that audience for your students, that they're talking to managers. That's creating that authentic component, like what they will tend to do when they enter the workplace, right? Yeah. So if you think about it, I mean, you cannot make that assignment authentic without explaining who the audience is.
Right.
Right? So that's kind of my point with that audience has to be part of that, and that's a real limitation to the writer-speaker-centered kind of writing. I mean, you can still get the grade, and you might do a fabulous job writing the paper, you might do a fabulous job giving a presentation, but if we leave out the audience, we lose a lot of that authenticity of that assignment. The fact that this really is a process between ourselves and the audience. Okay, so let's move over to audience-centered then. So let's go backwards this time, and let's talk about the constraints, because I think some of those might be some of the benefits of writer-speaker-centered. So we don't need to, we can just state those quickly, but what are some of the constraints of being audience-centered, or the limitations?
One is misinterpreting your audience. Not
Absolutely.
really knowing, or having an assumption about who they are and then presenting to them and it missing the mark. You know, it happens often in sales where you're selling, you're presenting to the non-decision maker.
Yeah, and this is misunderstanding the audience, because sometimes we almost always have to make inferences about our audience, which can actually, and this is where my students, almost every time this comes up, that it moves us into stereotyping and some of the problems with stereotyping. So that is something that we have to be aware of. Are we stereotyping a group of people because of a certain age or a certain ethnicity? But we have to draw some of those inferences to the best of our abilities unless we can actually give them a questionnaire and let them answer questions for us. And I used to do that at San Jose State because I taught a public speaking class. So we would have a nondescript audience assignment, and then they would get feedback from their audience, and then they would know exactly how their audience felt on the topic, and they would alter their presentation for their specific audience. But how often do we really get to do that? We do have to draw some conclusions by what we know about them. Okay, Brian.
I think this was touched on a bit earlier, but it seems as if writing for an audience requires a pretty strong command of form and genre of a certain kind of writing, which necessitates a different assignment maybe and different kinds of support for those who are doing the assignment. So there's a certain kind of scaffolding that may need to be built into something that really involves a clear understanding of the genre that one's writing in to address a certain kind of audience.
Yeah, especially when we're going with very specific audiences. Yeah, when we're talking about classmates, we kind of do a values, maybe like half a day we spend on values of college students. And so we get kind of an understanding of who our audience is. But yeah, when we have specific audiences, I would agree that's absolutely beneficial. Okay, any other constraints to being audience-centered?
That's more difficult, we said
It's
before.
more difficult. Yeah. And that's more time. We need to find more information. We need to look at different perspectives. We need to be able to understand other perspectives as well, which ultimately could even change how we perceive the issue if we're looking at differing perspectives. Okay, so now what are the benefits of being audience-centered? Why would we make this, spend time and energy on this with our students? Teaching about the audience, about audience analysis, and then how do we put evidence together? And actually, I'm going to go really quickly back to Ryan's point. I'm going to keep this more in general terms of audience and how we look at an audience as being like favorable, unfavorable, or kind of knowledge level, instead of going really deep into the specifics, because that would be very difficult for us to do with all of us coming from different walks of life.
It's beneficial to know who your audience is, because then you can develop your message to target that audience. So it's beneficial to have an understanding of who the audience is so that you can look for supportive sources that will resonate with that audience.
Because what is our goal with any communication process?
Convince them or persuade them or
Inform.
Inform
get them to do
them.
something. Yeah, hopefully to get them to do something.
Daphne? To connect with them?
Yeah.
Absolutely. That it is still, we're still operating in that basic communication model, whether it's a research paper or a presentation for a class. Okay, so without the audience, we are our own audience, and that's just not what we're looking to achieve typically, anytime, especially when we talk about authenticity. Very rarely are we ever writing a research paper just for ourselves, right? Okay, so now, what we've come up with with my classes are just general ideas of our audience. And we're going to move into, I have another slide. Let me make sure that's in here. Yeah, okay, that's next. So what we're trying to do is figure out especially if it's argumentative in nature, do I have a favorable audience? Do I have an unfavorable audience? Or do I have a neutral audience? And we talk about the different types of neutral audiences. And the last one we'll spend the most time on. But neutral audiences tend to be undecided, which means they are informed, like they're informed on both sides of the issue, but they just haven't made a decision. And I always ask my students to think of issues that they literally feel like they know quite a bit about it, but they're just kind of torn. Or like one day they're on one side and the next day maybe they're on the other side. And it's amazing how many come up with that. The next one is uninterested, like it's just not a topic that they even care about. So I talked to my students about, who mentioned this about making their students care, like know that it pertains to them or relates to them?
Yeah, for my current events presentation.
Yes, that's right, exactly what you were talking about. And how important that is, that if students find that it's not interesting to them, they do what? They zone out. So now you don't have an audience and you're back to being speaker or writer oriented, centered instead of audience centered. So we need to figure out a way that it connects. And I could go into more detail on that, but we spend quite a bit of time on introductions and conclusions, and that connectedness has to start right in the beginning and then remind them at the end as well why it was important to them. So we always talk about how do we connect the topic to the audience and connect the topic to ourselves. So our own credibility, but then why does the audience care? And then the last neutral audience is an uninformed audience. And this was an issue that's come up quite a bit, is that knowledge base of our audience. How much time do we have to spend with evidence to explain what we're doing? And when we talk about types of evidence, one type are definitions, can actually be a form of evidence, and oftentimes that helps us with that uninformed audience, spending time on defining things.
Well, it occurs to me that an uninformed audience can also be favorable or unfavorable.
They definitely can. Okay, but they can also be neutral in the sense that they're uninformed and they just say, good point, Nelson. They also can be uninformed and be neutral. Like, I don't know. I'd like to know. I want to learn more. I want to figure out how I feel about this, but I simply don't have enough information available to me at this point. But yes, we have very low informed audiences who definitely are favorable or unfavorable as well. Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive for sure in that sense. Okay, so when I was teaching professional communication, we came up with, well, this has been out there forever, but this is something we talked about, is breaking down what do we look for in that audience. We're going to focus predominantly on the demographics and understanding, but all of these things come into play. And Calvin, this is probably something you may have even seen teaching in the business department, because this is focused more on sales and trainings and whatnot. So the first thing we want to figure out is, who is that audience? College students. That's who we're talking about, let's say, since most of us talked about college students. So the next thing we want to ask, well, what is their understanding on the topic? So for all of you right now, you can mentally just think of maybe an assignment that you ask of your students, and what is their understanding in relation to that assignment or the topics that might come up with it. The next thing we would ask were their demographics. So now we start breaking down that audience. So they're college students, but what do we know about college students? What's their age, their education level? And we're going to work with that in a little bit, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. And then probably some of you have heard of, just to keep the nice little audience thing going, they have like interest, environment, needs, customization, expectations. But when we get to interest, we're starting to talk more about psychographics, like what do those demographics mean? Like, what is their interest in it? What is their connection with this? And the rest of it, I'm going to let you just take a quick look at it. I think the needs are definitely important, but like needs and expectations sometimes kind of overlap a little bit. So we think about, what does our audience need from this presentation? What does our audience need from this paper? Or what do they expect from us? And one expectation we'll talk about is they expect us to be a reliable source for them. Okay, so let's move into demographics versus psychographics. So the first thing we need to do is start figuring out who that audience is. So let me ask you, let's take college students. So in a typical college class, Who are our students demographically? What do we see from them? Is there anything they tend to have in common for the most part?
Most of the time, their age, mostly.
Yeah, and this is going back to some of the constraints of being audience-centered, right? We might have 90% of the audience a certain age bracket, but we still have that 10 that aren't. I've actually taught classes here at CSUMB with one male in the class. And I tell my students, so do we leave? Do we just say we have a female audience then? Do we leave that one male out? He's still part of the audience, right? So that does become one of the constraints of being audience-centered. Like, how do we account for all of them? So mostly age, and that age would be what?
18 to 22.
18 to 22 typically. So then we would move over to psychographics and we'd start asking ourselves, well, what are the attitudes? What are the values, the beliefs? Ultimately, their behaviors, because we probably will be asking a behavior from them, whether it's even just to accept our claims, whether it's to actually go out and do something about the problem, whatever. So what are some values or beliefs that you think 18 to 22-year-olds might hold? And this is where we start getting into those inferences and potential stereotypes.
Well, in the business school, it's interesting because during that library session, Ken Garcia does this online survey. And one of the questions he always asks is, why are you in business school? And the first question, or most of the answers that come up are dollar signs.
Money.
Just about the money.
So now you can talk about specific students, business students, right? And you have actually a little bit of evidence that you can apply to it. But what I argue with my students, we all can get some of that evidence.
Sure.
You can go out and research what the values of 18 to 22-year-olds are. We don't just have to infer it and like come to our own conclusions. There have been studies done on it, what their greatest values are. And money is one of them. Independence is one of them. So there are a lot of different values that they hold to. So then what we need to do is think about, well, how does our topic connect to those values? So how can I take my topic, I don't know, let me just pull one out. Well, let's just say that I want to argue that we're seeing a loss of democracy given the activity that we did. So I might think about, well, what values do my students hold that pertain to democracy? And it might be independence is part of democracy and having a voice and being heard. So I would try to attach to that value with them, right? So I'm not just attaching to their age, I'm taking that age and I'm translating it into the psychographic that correlates with it. Does that make sense? So when they do a basic demographic breakdown, the next thing they have to do is then do a small little research assignment to figure out what the psychographics are. So what are the actual values we're going to connect to?
Regarding the psychographics, I think within that age group there are maybe some contradictory things. When you look at things at a national level, how do you address that?
Yeah, and a lot of times what happens is we have different demographics have to come into play with one another. So obviously we could have age 18 to 22, but if everyone in our class comes from an upper middle class family, that's going to alter that belief system that they might have. So we talk about how they intersect with one another, that they don't happen in a vacuum, that this is all, you know, that concept of intersectionality is what actually creates our values and our beliefs. So I have them start bridging those together. So if they look at people who are high income earners versus low income earners, what are the values for them? And now let's combine that with where do our students fall with income versus where they fall for age.
You mentioned an assignment that you give them to research the psychographics. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
And that basically what we do is I have the students think about the demographics of the class, and they literally just do it from looking at each other or what time they've been together and gotten to know one another. They make a list, and then I just ask them to just go and do a brief research activity on it. Like, so what are the values of 18 to 22-year-olds? What are the values of upper income earners? That kind of thing. So whatever they come up with the demographics for that class, then they go and research it. I've done it where they've done it as a group, like one group does the age, one group does the income, one group does the gender. Usually gender's pretty split, but every now and then it's not. I teach gender and communication and interpersonal communication, and so sometimes those, right, Daphne, that 214, you teach that, don't you? A lot of times that will be really heavy on women. So sometimes gender does play into it, and other times it's just sort of neutral, like a neutral thing.
Do you give them reliable sources that they can look to find that information, or do they just sort of go off and...
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I don't really give them reliable sources, but I tell them to look up like things like the U.S. Census, helps them with income or like income components like statistics. Now they kind of just do it on their own, to be honest, also. And it probably would be better because it's just a small homework assignment. I don't make this like a big assignment, but they do have it a little bigger when we do the final activity we're going to do. And that's where they assess their audience there.
My impression has been that the Pew Research Centers may be one of the best or the best national sources on that civic opinion and kind of demographic information, so that might be a resource that they could look to.
Ask a librarian.
Yes, I know they tend to
Pew
use
Research Center.
Gallup a lot, but I will add that. And actually, Nelson, you bring up a really good point that maybe I should give them some specific places to look for that. Yeah. Okay. So any questions about this? So it's not so, I know we always hear people saying we have to understand the demographics of our audience, but it's not just the demographics we have to understand. We have to understand how those translate into the psychographics. That's what's important, because that's their belief system. And that's what we're trying to connect with and attach to, are those beliefs. And ultimately, hopefully, turn those into behaviors, potentially. Okay. So how do we do that? So how do we take these psychographics and what do we do with them when we connect them to evidence, right? So great, we know the values, we know how our audience feels, but now how does that translate into how we use them in our research? So ethos, pathos, logos, known as Aristotle's persuasive proofs, I think they've become more commonly known as audience appeals. I don't know how many of you utilize them in your classes or talk about them, but I find it very difficult to talk about being audience-centered without bringing these into the discussion personally, especially when we're trying to link to evidence. Because to me, this is the link. So I gave all of you a handout. If you want to turn to this page here, the second page, here, and those are handouts that you can keep if you would like. So what I have is this circle with ethos in the middle and logos and pathos on the outside of that circle. And ethos comes first, I personally believe, for a reason. Logos and pathos, the way you utilize those are a big part of how your credibility is established in a paper or a presentation. So one thing I talk about with my students, and this is why I have the big approved stamp, is that we don't come into anything, any communication setting with credibility. We don't. Our audience, it all depends on our audience. Our audience gives that to us. If they don't deem us credible, then we're not credible, because the purpose of that process is to connect with our audience, right? So if they don't see us as a credible source, what's going to happen with that message? It won't be heard. They'll tune it out, right? Right away, it turns off. I give my students an example. I'm not kidding, this is the first semester I had ever taught. I was a TA, and I was teaching a public speaking class, and I had a student give a presentation, a pro-life presentation. And he starts with his attention getter saying, how many of you have had an abortion or had a girlfriend or husband or wife who's had an abortion? Oh, wow. And I'm like, first of all, no one's going to raise their hand to that, right? But then the next thing he said was, well, if so, then you could be classified as a murderer. So right away, so not only is his credibility decreasing with his audience, the message itself is now not sounding like an ethical message, right? Even people who are pro-life probably would not respond favorably to that. So we have to not only think about the credibility of ourselves, but what's the credibility or the ethical component of the message we're talking about? Will our audience even deem it to be ethical? Then we can start moving into the pathos and logos. But at any time, our audience could deem it unethical. So we have to really be careful about that. How can we keep this unfavorable audience, let's say, with us through the whole presentation? How do we keep them listening to us? And that's the key here. So what Aristotle argues is for a message to be persuasive. I don't even think it's about just being persuasive. I think it's about a message appealing to an audience. You have to have that credibility as a speaker. Your message also, which this gets left out a lot, that the message itself must be ethical. They must be able to appeal to their emotions and their logic. But what I'm going to argue when we apply specific target audiences, that sometimes there's different percentages with these two, with the pathos and the logos. Even with ethos, if somebody supports your stance on an issue, they're going to give you a lot more credibility. They're going to want to see you as a reliable source, as a, wow, that person's awesome, right? If they align with your belief. It's the person who doesn't align with our belief that we're going to run into problem areas. So before we get to the activity, let's go a little bit more into this, and then I'll have you do this activity that my students do. So now I'm not arguing that statistics, so these are the 4 types of evidence: statistics, definitions, expert testimony, examples. People might argue there's more or different names for them, but we'll talk about that. So statistics, we all know, tend to be studies or surveys, the numbers that come from studies or surveys. And those tend to connect more to our logos, to that logical appeal. So when we have an unfavorable audience, what are we seeking from that unfavorable audience? What do we want from them? Because we're probably not going to get them to tomorrow go out and start collecting signatures for our stance on the issue, right? What do we want from that audience that we know believes differently than we do?
We want them to consider.
Exactly. We want them to consider our point of view. We want them to understand this issue maybe from another perspective. So we're just trying to increase understanding of the issue. So what we're going to do in that case is we're going to try to use really reliable sources, right? That is very hard for them to mentally knock those sources down. So if they believe our information, they have no choice but to start thinking about that issue a little differently. Because what I want is, I tell my students, and this is a problem, I don't want you think, or students thinking, that if we have an unfavorable audience, we should change our stance on the issue, right? Or that we should change the issue. Because we will always have unfavorable audiences in life. We will always have audiences that disagree with us. So we need to figure out how to engage with those audiences. And I use this both for interpersonal communication as well as cooperative art. As you can see, this is very helpful with interpersonal as well. So if we have an unfavorable audience, we're going to rely more heavily on things like statistics. We're going to rely more heavily on expert testimony, meaning tried and true experts in the field. What we're going to try to stay away from a little bit, not that completely, are examples. So we still always want some pathos in there. We're never going to get rid of any of these, but we don't want to rely heavily on it. Matter of fact, do you know what pathos is the root word for?
Pathetic.
Pathetic. That when something's too emotional, it becomes pathetic in nature. So that's what we're trying to stay away from with an unfavorable audience, for them to be able to deem something as pathetic. Hence, we turn it off. We don't listen. So I'm not saying that pathos is only used for favorable audiences or statistics are only used for unfavorable. It's just that that's where we want to have a little more of our focus, if it's an unfavorable or favorable audience. So another form of evidence, definitions, and I know I don't have to explain what all these are to you. All of you mostly know it. But definitions can be evidence or they cannot be evidence. Definitions can be your own interpretation of something, your own way of defining something, or you can also use a source that defines something. And if you use a source for a definition, it becomes a piece of evidence. And that we tend to use a lot more of when we have an uninformed audience, or their knowledge base is minimal. So we need to spend more time with definitions than we might if they understand. So we're going to have an example in a little bit about vaccinations. And you know, if you're speaking to a group of people who don't know what the dip-tep is, I probably want to spend some time defining what dip-tep is, right? But if I'm talking to doctors, I probably don't need to spend time explaining that. So we need to, this is all about time too. Like, we don't want to waste time on something that we don't need to. So that's an important part as well. And then expert testimony works for both. And what I spend a lot of time explaining the difference between expert testimony and an example. So I guess I'll put that out to you. What's the difference between an expert source who has a quote about something versus an example in a paper?
Well, an example can be given without actually sourcing an expert.
It could be your roommate.
Right.
Next door neighbor that grows pot.
Right.
Sure.
Can be
That
any
was
kind
a
of-
source in one of my papers. Not like it.
Well, nowadays there's a few of those neighbors, right, in California. So, okay, good examples. Good examples of examples.
I think an expert testimony is, you know, coming from somebody who has a really broad and deep understanding of a particular issue, understands the major issues and perspectives, and so it's coming from a very informed position, whereas the example is just anecdotal.
Yeah.
So it could, you know, it's almost, it's not necessarily placed in a broader context.
Exactly, and I use whether CSUMB is a good university. And a student who went to the university, they're an example. They're not an expert. Even though they went to the university, they're one anecdotal example. And I can find another person who went to this same university who can give a totally different story about CSUMB. But somebody from WASP maybe, who studies universities and how they work and outcome-based education or whatnot, they would then be more of an expert if they talk about what we're doing well here at CSUMB.
And one of the things that I've talked to students about is that when you cite an expert, you're often borrowing credibility from that expert. And usually examples are meant to illustrate, or their anecdotes are meant to illustrate. They can be evidence, but we can't extend too far from that evidence.
Yeah, and sometimes I even talk about kind of like a hierarchy with examples being the very least persuasive ultimately, like they're the easiest to argue against of anything else, but they're actually very persuasive with a favorable audience because they give us that emotional appeal. So I tell my students they need to diversify evidence, but if they determine they have a very favorable audience, I would like to see a little more pathos. So Daphne and Dan, you both talked about sources not always being so reliable. Well, in this case, that's acceptable because the purpose with that is to get to an emotional response. It's not to weigh the validity of it, the logical aspect of it. It's to weigh that emotional connection. And we can't remove ourselves from that emotional connection. I mean, ethos, pathos, and logos have been taught for centuries now for a reason, right? So that emotion does have to be part of it, but it can't be all of the message, Daphne, right? It simply can't be, especially in an academic paper. And that's where the instructor has to be part of the audience too, right? Okay, so I have a little example here between pathos and logos. So vaccinations save lives. Just keeping it very simplistic. This would have to be for my classes if they were arguing it a little more focused. So let's just go with logos first, actually. So here we have a statistic. In 2005, 1.5 million children under the age of 5 died due to lack of vaccinations. Now my students will always argue, well, that's emotional. Children are dying. But when I actually give that stat in a presentation, when I write that stat in a paper, it doesn't come across emotional. It comes across more logical, like, wow, 1.5 million children, that's a lot. Like our brain attaches to that component of it.
I'm wondering if you talk about pathos and logos, piece of information as different ways of framing a narrative. So I'm thinking of like a magazine article that begins with a pathos section and then moves on to several logos sections, and if you talk about how with your students how you might interweave those and structure them together.
Okay, yeah, so with the introductions and conclusions, I hold to terminology that I know a lot of people don't hold to, but it's psychological orientation and logical orientation. And then of course the hook or the attention getter first. And that hook can be a statistic, but it's better if that statistic connects with something that's emotional driven. And then the psychological orientation is emotion driven. That's like where we're truly paying attention to the values of our audience and how do we connect to those values. So I definitely do that. Like make sure that those connections are made. And not just in the intro and the conclusion, that then also as you build your arguments, you make sure you do get some of those examples in there to elicit the pathos, right? To elicit that connectedness. So we understand, well, I chose this example because it's kind of extreme. There's a lot of different ways we can pull out pathos with it. But that story of a kid that dies really impacts us, right? And we see that with commercials, you know, if it's an issue that we wouldn't be against, like children starving, no one thinks children should be starving. So they know they have a favorable audience, so the bulk of those commercials are emotion driven, right? Did I answer your question? Okay. Nelson.
I just think, I always talk about these as a matter of emphasis rather than as purely distinct. So when your students say the 1.5 million children under the age of 5 die is emotional, yes, it is.
Yeah.
There is an element of pathos there, and there is an element of ethos there. You know enough to cite a statistic.
Mm-hmm.
However, the emphasis is that you're making it as part of a logical argument.
Exactly, and so that's why I always have ethos right in the center, in that circle. I never talk about them the way we actually have them listed here. I always have that ethos in the circle, because whatever we're doing is our audience is always assessing our credibility because of it. So when we combine something that's more logical with something that's pathos driven, then we're probably increasing our credibility. I'm not sure about this example, but I wanted you to pick out the parts that you thought were really emotionally driven, and where do you think they may have went too far with it. So let's look at this other example of evidence. So it comes from the Washington Post. That came from the World Health Organization. Washington Post, we could argue somewhat biased, but that's all right. It's from a published source at least. On May 23rd, a 6-year-old boy developed strange symptoms that landed him in a local hospital. Less than 1 month later, he lost his fight and succumbed to the disease. The most troubling part is that the disease was preventable. However, his parents have been convinced by anti-vaxxers that he did not need vaccinating. Now, as the family grieves, they recognize that vaccinating their son would have saved his life. What do you think about this example? For emotion, does it go too far for you? And that's what we talk about a lot. Where have they tried to impact things too much? Or where did they not impact them enough for their audience?
Anti-vaxxers sounds kind of derogatory.
And
It's a name calling in some respects.
yes, it's going below the belt kind of stuff, right?
I don't think it has a positive connotation. I don't know how anti-vaxxers refer to themselves, but I don't know if it's anti-vaxxer.
Exactly. So I think even a favorable audience might wince a little bit at that. So I use examples like this for them to understand when an example can go too far with the emotions, and then we start losing the purpose of it. And the purpose is to understand the human connectedness of this stat, right? So 1.5 million children die, and there is an emotional component to that. But when we hear the story of a kid who dies and the parents grieving the loss of their son, now we feel it. We understand it, now we start feeling it.
So, I mean, it sounds like in this exercise you're getting students to evaluate whether or not an example has gone too far. Can you answer that without really knowing who your audience is? Are there cases where...
That's why this comes after us doing audience analysis typically, but yeah, sorry.
Okay. So I was wondering if there's cases where this is always going to be too far.
I personally think this is always going to be too far, myself. So my students, instead, we talk about what shouldn't be in this to make it a more usable example. Like, where do we go too far? That even a favorable audience member might get hung up on something in the example and then lose what we're trying to do with the example.
So in the classroom discussion, who is the audience that you are
College
working with?
students.
Or other college students?
For my classes, typically, it's almost always college students. But for us, we're going to have some different audiences
So
right
they're
now.
talking to their classmates, but you're using the situations, you're using this example with those in the class.
Oh, well,
I'm
no,
just trying to
and
think.
then no, we do talk about different audiences, and that's next. You're just one step ahead of me. Let's go there. So, yes.
Just thinking about the anti-vaxxers, I'm wondering if, when you've done this with your students before, if there's ever been a point made about there being multiple emotions that can be generated through a single example. So, pathos, of course, sadness or grief is one. But I'm wondering if another emotion that might be incited by that example is anger. And to that extent, the use of the term anti-vaxxers would resonate with a favorable audience that is angry at this group of people anyways.
Yeah, and okay, so that's where we're at now with having more specific audiences rather than students. But with students, I think most favorable students would probably take some, but you still run the risk of losing the focus of that example, like the purpose of the example.
Do you, when you do that exercise with students, do you talk to them about who reads the Washington Post?
We always talk about those things, like who's reading who owns the Washington Post, who funds the Washington Post. So then that's going into biases of evidence and trustworthiness of our evidence. So, which you've discussed a lot as well. So I just didn't bring a lot of that in because I'm trying to stay audience focused. But this all does like double, triple duty. I mean, so it's not like I'm spending all this time just teaching audience analysis in my class. I'm teaching underlying assumptions, I'm teaching source credibility, I'm talking about the different types of evidence and their significance. Like going back to this is 2 days worth of class for me, just talking about the different types of evidence and where do statistics come from and what are the problems with relevance and representation with numbers, and you know what I'm saying? So it's much deeper than always. I hope. I mean, I think it is, but hopefully they do too. So now, Dan, so you're just one step ahead of me here. So now taking that information, how might you choose and explain evidence differently based on the following audiences? So given that topic of vaccinations, if we were talking to students at an elementary school, what would we need to do with our evidence? Like right away, what's the first thing we know we would need to do, spend a lot of time on?
Background information.
Background information, definitions, getting them to understand it, right? What are vaccinations? What are the mumps? What is rubella, right? What do these mean? Those terms even mean.
Yeah.
Where with, now we can compare that with Doctors Without Borders, we wouldn't have to spend time with that. And do you think Doctors Without Borders tend to be a favorable audience to vaccinations?
Sure.
My guess would be yes, that's one of the things they do is provide vaccinations. So how might our evidence look differently if we're talking to Doctors Without Borders? That was our audience versus students in elementary school. Which, by the way, they're probably going to be a neutral audience or unfavorable because they got the shot last week and they're like, I don't like vaccinations. So those are things we'd want to keep in mind. But Doctors Without Borders, what would our focus be then, evidence-wise?
Statistics.
Maybe some statistics, but they might know a lot of those.
Expert testimony.
I guess, I mean, you wouldn't need to argue for vaccinations with for Doctors Without Borders, so it changes your whole purpose.
So what would we want from them if we're writing a paper about vaccinations to Doctors Without Borders, or we're giving a presentation?
Would be cultural issues that would apply to the Washington Post article, that Doctors Without Borders are dealing with skepticism of third world country population, right?
And different religions within those countries and how they view vaccinations. So we have a whole different focus, but we're also going to have a goal of getting them to act. Okay, so they just came back from their tour. We want them to go out for another tour, right? We want them to sign up to do it again. So we want to make sure they have that emotional connection, which they probably have because they've been there and they've seen it. Ryan?
Oh, I was going to mention call to action.
Yeah, good, very good. So there's a call to action. We want these doctors to continue with these efforts. So we would probably work a little more on the emotional appeal than all the statistics because they probably have a lot of those. We'd have them, we wouldn't get rid of them, but we would have more flexibility to go emotional with this group. What about parents? Just parents in general. So you're just giving your presentation or writing a paper to people who are parents. You don't know if they're vaccinated or not vaccinated, you just know they have children.
Yeah, both sides.
Yeah, so now we might have where we actually look at our audience almost like an undecided audience because we have some parents that support and some that don't. My guess is most parents do, but probably not to the same extent as Doctors Without Borders, right? So we want to balance our evidence with parents. We want to make sure we don't go too emotional, right? We want to make sure we give them lots of statistics and concrete information that they probably don't have and don't know that they can hold to understand the issue. Because no matter what, we're still being ethical, right? We're still being honest about our research here. And then the last one I put was Christian Scientists, which probably most of you know tend to believe there are no such thing as diseases, that everything that happens to us can be prayed about and worked through religious means rather than medication typically. I'm generalizing there. I don't know if anyone's a Christian Scientist here, but that's generally their belief. So what kind of audience are they going to be?
Unfavorable.
Unfavorable. So in this case, what's our goal with that audience?
Consider the possibility that vaccinations might be necessary.
Yeah, that vaccinations might be useful and helpful. So we would probably use more logos-oriented evidence in that case. So one thing I wanted to mention, let's move to our final thoughts here. And this was, obviously, for me, I spend weeks on all of this. Like, this was my biggest stress, was figuring out how can I take like 4 weeks of material, flesh out, because we're always doing double and triple duty with things, like how do these things work, like we talked about with underlying assumptions, etc. So how do I flesh all that out and get it into a 2-hour, like feasible, workable, practical thing for all of us? So I just want you to keep that in mind, that this is not a 2-hour, like one class session kind of thing with our students. How quickly I had you go through the activities was far quicker than with my students. There's usually more like specific prompts with things that take more time to work with. So just, you know, keep that in mind as you enter out into this world of audience analysis and evidence analysis.